of the Jumbo Glacier. And born in Calgary, he now lives with his wife Christy and son Finn in Victoria, and he's an avid cyclist, outdoor enthusiast, and a soccer coach. So.
Did I say that? All right, thank you.
Welcome, Cam.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, that's a tough act to follow. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. As Jenny mentioned, I'm Cam Owens. I teach in the geography department at UVic, and I teach classes on environmental impact assessment after having completed my doctoral research looking at the never-ending story of Jumbo Glacier Resort and land use planning and environmental assessment in the province. And I was thinking I'd love to bring a whole bunch of you back with me to actually be guest speakers in that class because there's so much knowledge in this room. You can probably imagine what a thrill it is to see the subject of your research up on the big screen like this in this beautifully shot feature documentary, and probably even a bigger thrill for many of you who this has been a big part of your life over the last couple decades. So I want to thank Nick Wagner and Patagonia and WildSite for putting this on to CMI as well for this amazing conference today. What I'll try to do here is actually build on the movie, but also draw on themes that we've been looking at in this environmental and social impact assessment forum. And I'd really like to thank all the people that shared their stories with me when I completed my research looking at the Jumbo case. Of course, I'd like to acknowledge the Tanaka people on whose traditional territories we gather. And I hope one of the main messages that comes out of this movie and this conference that we're in is that any meaningful progress towards social and environmental sustainability in this province is contingent on genuine, deep reconciliation and a radical rebalancing of the relationship with Indigenous peoples of this province, or what we now call British Columbia. So what I wanted to do was to build on the movie, and I usually bounce around and get really animated, but I realize it's late, and so I actually have notes that I'm going to stay near, so I stay on track, and I don't keep you here all night. But I want to build on the movie and share some of my reflections on the struggle over Jumbo and speak frankly about the politics of environmental assessment. There's a lot of talk about environmental assessment being politicized, certainly in the Jumbo case, but in numerous cases across the province. And there's always, we always call to kind of depoliticize environmental assessment. But I want to interrogate that. What would depoliticizing environmental assessment mean? I argue that the dream of a perfect, objective, rational, apolitical environmental assessment is the stuff of sci-fi. Instead, what I'm going to argue is we actually have to repoliticize EA, democratize EA. We want more politics, not less politics, but the kind of politics that includes voices, not excludes them. But before I get into that, I do want to sort of position myself here. What I have to say tonight comes from somewhere. I don't purport to have some kind of superior, privileged view of things. The final word on Jumbo. I was kind of embarrassed when the story in the Pioneer said Dr. Jumbo is coming. Indeed, I think there's many folks out in the audience tonight that know much more about this place, much more about this project, and much more about this process than I do. I do have one unique advantage, that I was able to sit across the table from dozens of folks and listen to their stories and then try to sift through those perspectives and make sense of this complex case. So this is one geographer scholar's view. A couple of other things that might help situate me. I'm obviously a white settler to these lands. I grew up in Calgary to a very, very conservative father and a strangely progressive mother. I'm grateful that they afforded me the opportunity to get an education. One of my grandpas was a farmer in eastern Saskatchewan and got booted off the farm at 14 and was literally a real life hobo that rode the rails looking for work and finally ended up in Calgary selling windows. And so it's amazing that 2 generations later, I'm able to be here and teach at UVic and actually talk about things like these. But I knew next to nothing about environmental assessment until my PhD. I completed bachelor's and master's degrees at the U of C in political science, which strangely I got booted out the end of that as kind of an environmentalist, even though I had courses with folks like Tom Flanagan and Stephen Harper was a guest speaker. And I remember one class where I had Jason Kenney, Rob Anders, and Ezra Levant as my classmates. I don't know if those names ring a bell for you. Hopefully not, but if they do, you know the trauma that I suffered. But anyway, and interest in geography and a real interest in places and sense of place. I traveled a bunch. I had many great years as a ski bum in Lake Louise. That's what Alberta kids did back in those days before the oil sands, I guess, lured you away after school. I ended up on the coast at SFU with my wife and my son, Finn, scrambling for a thesis topic. And I have a dear friend who's actually in attendance tonight to thank for helping me find one. Because she kept telling me these stories about this crazy struggle that she was involved with, this ski resort proposal near Invermere that had environmental concerns, but the language was more around democracy and Indigenous justice and a flawed environmental assessment process. And this complex conflict attracted me. And I came out, interviewed around 45 people in the Kootenays and in Victoria, poured over thousands of pages of documents and conducted research trying to make sense of what had confounded the jumbo review process so as to drag for over 2 decades. And probably even more confused than I was when I started. But that's briefly a little bit just to situate me. I love the notion of telling stories and of stories. Maybe my mom was a small bookseller before Amazon and Chapters wiped those out. But I love this notion of stories. And Robert Waganisi says here that, all that we are is story. And skipping to the end, when we can do that, and we can take the time to share these stories with each other, we get bigger inside. We see each other. We recognize our kinship. We change the world one story at a time. So this movie was about a number of stories. And Nick, I think actually Wade Davis originally said this in the movie, he positioned the mountain as this mirror, but then it became a theme throughout the movie of this mirror reflecting back the assumptions, the desires, the values, the stories of those looking upon it, summarized to some extent in this cartoon. And I want to center assumptions and values and stories in our discussion that we've been having at this conference all day about environmental assessment. And as I said, talk frankly about the politics of environmental assessment. Now, whether you were at the conference today or not, that EA should be political might actually kind of make you a little bit unsure. But I'm not the only one saying this. This is from a planning prof at MIT, and he says that people that are practicing in environmental assessment, or even those that have been a part of one, have to admit a few things. At first, EAs are not science. Hopefully they draw on good science, but they're never going to be science. Second, environmental assessments are always contain unexamined and unexplained value assumptions. Third, they'll always be political. And finally, that should not be a problem. And I want to try to convince you of that. Although most often, our response is more to, decry the lack of scientific rigor, to complain about the imposition of values into a scientific endeavor, to mutter darkly about politics tainting the rational objective enterprise that constitutes environmental assessment, right? But I want to, then maybe many of you feel that way, but I want to try to convince you otherwise. It's not so much politics, but the type of politics. I think this quote from, and I'll stop quoting, it's not the right time of day to be quoting academics, I know, but this is the last one, I promise. French philosopher Jacques Rancière, and I think this is a great way of getting into what we mean by politics, and it also links in geography and environmental assessment. Politics for Rancière, he says, in the end, it's a matter of who comes to be qualified to say what a place is and what is done there, right? We look out across the Jumbo Valley or look out across this landscape here, and we see different places. And politics, for better or worse, is this mechanism for what stories are going to prevail over that landscape. And who gets to decide that, Right? What is this place and what is to be done there? Well, we heard a number of stories in that movie, right? In one story, this is the perfect place for the ultimate alpine resort experience, presenting a rare constellation of supportive features and accessibility and aspect and elevation. And given the valley's long history of logging and mining and recreation, the resort that would be built there wouldn't be encroaching on pristine wilderness. In fact, the village would be built on an old sawmill site. You know, what is to be done? Well, make this spectacular place accessible to the world. This is a rare opportunity. Take advantage of it. Okay. But we heard other stories. You know, to a diverse number of locals, hunters, school teachers, business people, environmentalists. This is exactly the wrong place for such a project. The valley is critically, ecologically, core grizzly bear habitat, an important community resource, contributing immensely to local sense of place. And a resort just doesn't make sense on a number of levels, socially, economically, culturally. This place is to be protected, allowed to regenerate, to be left wild. And then we heard the story eloquently from Joe Pierre that this, to the Tanakha people, this is Gatmuk, a sacred place, home to the grizzly spirit and at the heart of their unceded traditional territory, and part of a much bigger struggle over lands that they've lived on for hundreds of generations. A place where the Tanakha have drawn the line in the sand after decades of being marginalized and seeing their land stolen and developed to the benefit of others. A place to which elders are uncompromising about honoring and protecting. And what is to be done? Well, as indicated by the Gatmuk Declaration, to establish a refuge, the unique and proper place to celebrate the honor the grizzly spirit. So what is this place, and who is qualified to decide? Okay, when we put it that way, you know, the Environmental Assessment Office, that makes the role of environmental assessment seem a lot more dramatic and a lot more political than implied in the standard definition of some neutral technical process to identify and attempt to mitigate the potential significant adverse impacts of proposed developments. It's not its explicit objective, but it seems to me that EA ends up playing a pretty central role in assessing and evaluating different stories, different values, especially in the absence of robust participatory land use planning in the province or some other mechanism for working out these crucial big picture concerns. The decisions EA makes help bring into being certain worlds and foreclose other worlds. And either consciously or unconsciously, it has this role then of shaping what a place is and what is to be done there. And we might thus ask legitimately about the extent to which it is qualified to do so. Certainly in the Jumbo case, the notion that EA was qualified to make such decisions was questioned, not only in terms of the process, what I want to get to in a moment, but even the authority to make decisions itself. For example, questions around appropriate scale of decision-making. Locals were emphatic that decisions should be made by those most affected, about local social license. And they were thus incensed when the regional district rezoning process, which would have involved a robust public input component, was subverted by the province's decision to establish this resort municipality, which the strange story told in the film here. To the supporters or proponents, they were a little bit more comfortable with provincial decision-making. I actually spent an afternoon walking around the site with Grant Costello, and one thing he told me was, you know, if the CP Railway that brought this great nation together, it never would have been built if locals had a say. So it's another view. But we might then ask, you know, when is localism, selfish NIMBYism, and anathema to some greater provincial or national good? And when is it about legitimate stewardship of one's place, as Pat told me? You know, indeed, it could be argued that the provincial interest is best served when local people are caring about their places. Either way, the question around appropriate scale and how to treat public input in the review renders EA decision-making much more political and less something objective, neutral, technical. There's actually something at play, something debated here. And this is further complicated by thinking about those who were never at the table, future generations and non-humans and others. We might think that experts are the ones qualified to decide, but who are the experts when it comes to talking about the kinds of places that we want to live in? Are the experts government scientists or local knowledge holders? But in this case, it's probably most complicated by questions of competing expressions of sovereignty. To the Tanaha, the question of who is qualified to decide is pretty clear. And this painting, not by a Tanaha person, but by Musqueam Lawrence Paul Yohoilipton, I think describes the notion of competing sovereignties in our province quite well. You can see kind of the symbolism of the BC flag, the state hanging over, maybe ephemeral, but somehow kind of disconnected. And then you see the Salish imagery in the mountains themselves of the generations upon generations of stories that have been embedded in that landscape directly. Right? It looks at these kind of competing notions of sovereignty, I think. Now, in many ways, we could end right here. I think what is to be done is to fulfill our ethical and legal obligations to finally decolonize. But at the very least, we should admit that EA sits in a pretty inescapably political context. But I want to look at the process. Just a picture. I'm not going to go through the environmental assessment process. But setting aside these big picture jurisdictional questions for a moment, I just want to explore environmental assessment itself as a political endeavor. Despite being represented as some neutral, apolitical, independent decision-making process. This is what one environmental assessment official told me about this process. It just shows how complicated it is if you think of how do you do an environmental assessment. It's not at all a straightforward process. There's a lot of complexity and uncertainty. Like how do you really assess the relative merits of jobs created versus, say, loss of habitat? And since it deals with social cultural impacts, it can't just be quantitative, technical, scientific. How do you technically assess quality of life or sacredness of place? So how do you? I asked another decision maker, in the context of complexity and uncertainty and quantitative and qualitative values and multiple potentially conflicting perspectives. And this is what she said. She said, well, it really is as much art as science. We hope we get a better decision by involving a lot of different people, but in the end, it's an informed judgment call. Right? So science, art, multiple perspectives, professional judgment, fair enough, but then I'd be interested in what is it that informs that judgment, right? Certainly to Jumbo opponents, they were pretty unequivocal about what informed decision-making, thinking of this process as a rubber stamp for business as usual, about predetermined decisions being granted some legitimacy through being called technical, or about backroom decisions being made on some island in the Pacific, which isn't that exotic. I live there. And elsewhere, actually, in other environmental assessments I've looked at, they said, okay, well, it couldn't be a rubber stamp. It dragged on for years. But then one attorney for the Honey-Gatine in Sokotan territory referred to environmental assessment as a Rube Goldberg machine. People know what that is? This a complex gadget that performs a simple task in an indirect, convoluted way. So there were a bunch of these cartoons, I think in the New York Times, that showed these crazy machines, and people loved them, the Rube Goldberg machine. But some say that, that this is maybe what environmental assessment does. It looks intense, and it's full, thousands of documents and big binders full of studies to confirm a predetermined decision. Right? Now, whether we go that far or not, it seems safe to say that generally there's an expectation or a hope that projects will go through. This was the first thing I ever read when I said, what is environmental assessment? I'd come from talking to people about Jumbo, and this is what I was told, that the provincial government is committed to a more flexible, efficient, and timely reviews of proposed major projects. This is why a new streamlined environmental... This was the first document I read. And so you may agree with this emphasis on efficiency and stimulating the economy, but I would have wanted to see more discussion about, the environment in an environmental assessment process. This is one of my favorite quotes from a decision maker, and I don't put this up here to mock or ridicule her at all. It just makes me see that the human context within which decisions are made. Right, so she says here, so we all were coptered up to Glacier Dome, by the proponents. So you can imagine her standing up on top of Glacier Dome in the Jumbo Valley, like in this cartoon here, looking out across this landscape. And I was raised up north, and I'd been thinking maybe it's a shame that they develop here. And I got up to Glacier Dome, and I realized that the mountains go on forever. There are lots and lots of mountains and valleys that are in some ways similar. This one, in fact, has a road in it for the last 60 years, and there's been logging twice, and there's been a mine up there. And I looked down from Glacier Dome and said there would only be a few people that would be able to get up here to look out across this expansive place. Wouldn't it be fabulous if you could bring your great Aunt Mary up here and bring her up in a gondola to a little tea house so that people could experience that and see it? And if it was done properly, it would really be a great thing. And it really changed my mind without anybody having to say anything. That became my feeling. It isn't a horrible, bad thing. This has real potential. So you see, this becomes her feeling, this becomes her intuition. And the hardest thing about this is that she's saying it's not from people telling her anything. I'm looking and seeing this myself. But we've seen other people standing up here looking out and seeing something different. As Nick brings up in the movie, the mountains are reflecting back our assumptions, our values, our stories. I'll go through this one quickly. It's not a slide to show at whatever time it is, 8:30 or something. But I just wanted to give a sense of some of these things that then decision makers, environmental assessment officials, these are some of the questions in your head. So what we just talked about, what do my own experiences, beliefs, or intuitions tell me? But what else is going on? How do I deal with complexity and uncertainty? In my opinion, what is reasonable risk? What do my own experiences, beliefs, just said that. What is the office political culture like? What are the discourses circulating around in the office about how you prioritize jobs or competitiveness or climate change or grizzly bears or caribou or Aboriginal rights? Okay? What stakeholders are pressuring me? Who do I find most persuasive? Who do I trust? What does the law say? Do we have policy or guidance documents? What constraints are there in terms of timelines, financial capacity, workload and staffing? What does the science say? Which science? What forms of knowledge do I believe? What is the status quo? But these are just, some of the multiple questions then that are informing these decisions, which come at every stage of an environmental assessment. Okay, are we going to even do an environmental assessment, and what are we going to look at, and how are we going to judge whether impacts are significant? How are we going to judge if something is substantially started? Okay, so just to look at one of these things that happened in Jumbo to do with significance, because this is what environmental assessments turn on. Okay, they turn on assessments of significance, but we might immediately ask, well, how do you judge that? Significant to whom? And aren't impacts going to be more or less significant to people? How does EA, determine the significance of threats to sense of place or the sacredness of a valley, for example? And so in the end, that grizzly bear, according to almost all the decision makers I talked to, and I think to many others, that grizzly bears were one of the most important components of the Jumbo Glacier Resort environmental assessment. So how was it decided whether there would be significant impacts to grizzly bears? Well, I'll make a long story short. After an initial study was completed, looking at an inventory of the size and the seasonal distribution of the local bear population, the proponent hired, which is typical in an EA, the proponent will hire a consultant, Clayton Aspen Wildlife Research, to look at the potential impacts on the grizzly bear population health. And Apps used a sophisticated cumulative effects model to predict the resort and the road impacts on habitat effectiveness and grizzly mortality. And came to some kind of a conclusion that the resort development could not be mitigated within the jumbo drainage itself, but could be mitigated by restricting human access elsewhere. Okay? And through motorized access closures, a no net impact standard could theoretically be attained. Now, it's important to note that APPS defines significance here as no net impact. There was no guidance, there were no parameters within the EA, but the consultant believed that made sense, right? No net impact on grizzly bears. But it's kind of tricky if you think about that. There are a number of things, work we could do to look at the productivity of habitat and the population's reproductive rate and the size of the population that could determine and presumably influence decisions about allowable mortality. But ultimately, there's no scientific formula for determining how many grizzly bears we as a society are willing to sacrifice. That's not a scientific question so much as an ethical and political question, right? But that's what he thought would be a good measure. Now, the mitigation itself, pretty political too. You can probably imagine that the mitigation proposal wasn't very popular locally. All right, so we're going to have, we'll put this resort in here, which will nuke this valley, but we'll make up for it by closing off these other 6 or 7 drainages. The province's own grizzly expert weighed in, and he said he believed it was possible that the project could achieve a no net impact objective over the short term. However, it'll be very difficult and expensive. I think he was being very realistic about the capacity and resources that the province has. There's substantial opposition to access management for the purpose of mitigating grizzlies, he continues, so he recognized that. He elaborates further, saying that in the absence of extraordinary measures to ensure indefinite implementation of mitigation measures, it can be assumed that there will be substantial impact on grizzly bear habitat effectiveness, mortality risk, and most importantly, the fragmentation of grizzly bear distribution. All right. So at this point, there seems to be a lot of concern about grizzly bears. The proponent's own consultant suggests the resort would have a large impact, although he says it could be mitigated, but that would restrict access to other watersheds, which was not very popular with the public. The province's own expert is expressing concerns, is pretty dubious about the capacity to mitigate, enforce, and monitor on behalf of the province himself. So what do you suppose happens next? Well, it's kind of difficult to ascertain exactly what happens next. With a process deadline looming, Matt Austin is reassigned. Okay, the grizzly bear expert's reassigned, and there's actually a new EAO director too, Martin Glassman. And on June 2nd, 2004, this email was sent, and it represents a remarkable departure. All right, we noted that Austin had this serious skepticism, but that's not mentioned at all in this email. No concern about the monitoring program, no concern about the proposed mitigation. Moreover, and most important for what I'm trying to talk about here, judging significance, you can see that the goalposts have kind of shifted. No longer is no net loss the test for significance, but now the much less demanding that the loss does not result in a change of status for the grizzly bear population in the entire region. The Central Brussels should be GBPU, Grizzly Bear Population Unit, would become threatened. Okay, a technical term. So, in October 2004, Jumbo Glacier Resorts awarded its environmental assessment certificate, and the first line in the assessment has to do with grizzly bears. Stewart's email is cut and paste into the notice here. And notably, the contentious proposal to close off other drainages to offset loss of habitat effectiveness in the Jumbo Valley is not mentioned. Although the proponent's own consultant had said that, they had advised that effective mitigation would be required and that it would be something drastic. Of course, that was when no net impact was the evaluation criteria used. But clearly, and the point is, significance here is not based on some objective, unassailable principles, but based in this case, very shifting values assumptions. We clearly can say that this component of the EA process seems to be very politicized. Now, admittedly, this kind of story fuels this call to depoliticize EA, but as I've shown, for better or worse, EA is inherently political. It's about discretion, it's about values, it's about assumptions, it's about competing perspectives, as well as science. Of course, as we've seen, it can be about misrepresentation and self-interest and deception and unbalanced power relations. But I think the high modern dream of a perfect, objective, rational decision-making process, put all the data into the computer and it spits out the answer 42, for those that like Hitchhiker's Guide. I think that's untenable. It's the stuff of sci-fi. So this is why I think we need to re-politicize EA. We need to admit that EA is not a strict technical science. It is based on values assumptions. We want to understand, though, what is actually informing those assumptions. It makes decisions that empower certain stories about what places are and what is to be done in them. And thus it must be opened up, more deliberative, more transparent, more acknowledging of its role in shaping places. Now, there's a lot of things in this conference that we're talking about tweaking EA, but as I wind down here, I want to think, really big picture, seeing environmental assessment fitting in to this trajectory of these places we live in and cherish and depend on. And I want to finish with one story by a remarkable woman, Donella Meadows, whose life was immersed in scientific rationality and modeling, but who argued passionately that vision needed to be central in environmental policy. And she tells this fascinating story about a series of workshops that she ran, which brought the top nutritionists and demographers and ecologists and economists and development field workers together to address world hunger. And her plan was to begin the workshop by asking, what would the world be like with no hunger? Right? And so what do you think happened when she asked those, not to describe the world they thought they could achieve or the world that they would settle for, but the world, the world without hunger, the world they truly wanted. What do you think happened? Well, she was greeted by anger and derision. Said, what a stupid question. Visions are dangerous fantasies. Stop being so unrealistic. Interestingly, after those objections were tabled, the deeper ones started coming out. Well, I cannot stand thinking about a world without suffering because I'm so painfully aware of the suffering around me. I don't want to get my hopes up. I have a vision, but I feel childish expressing it. Okay? This latter remark struck her so hard that she was still thinking about it 10 years later when she wrote the paper. And kids have no problem with this. This is from a contest where they get kids to draw what a world without hunger looks like, and they have no problems with it, but adults do. And she said, why is it that we can share our cynicism, our complaints, and frustrations with perfect strangers without hesitation, but we can't share our dreams? How do we arrive at a culture that had labeled visions as childish and that constantly, almost automatically, ridiculed visionaries, whose idea of reality forces us to be realistic? So, when I started trying to look at environmental assessment and what it was and trying to say, well, I'm going to, do some research here. I hope it's not just some, really nerdy technical process. I learned it actually came out of a much bigger vision. It was looking to address the biggest challenges facing the 1960s America. Now, Meadows goes on to acknowledge that vision is not the only thing to care about. We need to think about data and models and processes and implementation. But as I close down this address, I ask us not to suppress our visions for what environmental assessment or environmental management in this province more generally could be about. In my vision, my big, not censoring vision, we decolonize and fulfill our ethical and legal obligations to First Nations, restoring their title to unceded lands. And we go above and beyond consulting and accommodating to embrace the principle of free, prior, and informed consent under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I'm not scared of that at all. I think it'd be better for all Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this province. I think we rekindle our entrepreneurial spirit in BC and Alberta and work, what would a regenerative renewables economy look like? Right? We develop perhaps a provincial version of the now defunct, but soon, I think, to be resuscitated roundtable on the economy and environment that happened at the federal government and got axed with the last government. A forum for these kinds of critical big picture discussions, and explore other innovative collaborative arrangements. I've was reading about the Elk Valley cumulative effects process from someone that passed it on to me at this conference. Amazing collaborative work. We look beyond project-based environmental assessments to strategic assessment and robust cumulative effects analysis. And when we do project-by-project assessments, we look at sustainability assessment, like Martin was talking about this morning. Where the test isn't just, doing less bad. It's about actually ensuring projects contribute to our long-term social, environmental, and economic well-being. And there are actually examples of that. We change the political culture within the Environmental Assessment Office. We change our political culture more. If I can be visionary here, no censoring, we change it more generally. But at a very practical level, I say we rekindle province-wide, deeply participatory land use planning that involves Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities as full partners. We started this with the CORE, the Community of Resources and Environment Commission on Resources and Environment process back in the 1990s. I'd love to see a newly improved version that would free environmental assessment to complete the task it's best suited for, examining the impacts of particular projects. I think one of the biggest headaches for environmental assessment officials now is that people show up to EA hearings, a Glacier Hauser Independent Power Project, for example, in Kaslo, and not interested in being directed into the narrow cubbyhole that they're supposed to talk about the technical effects of this one project. No, they want to talk about, is this trajectory-wise, is it good to have small little micro hydropower projects all over the province? Is it great to be selling BC's rivers? Well, there's no forum for those kinds of discussions. And so environmental assessment turns out to be that surrogate forum. And it's not really well suited for that. But I'd love to see something like a new version of the CORE process. And I just want to, as I wind down here, I promise, last couple slides. But I want to share this with you from Stephen Owen, who is the commissioner of CORE. When I read this is the kind of politics I think I'm talking about, at least the way he's describing it here. There were some flaws with the process on the ground. But he said, throughout its operations, CORE stimulated intense debate and controversy as it addressed its statutory responsibility to lead change and balance social, environmental, and economic interests through intense public and participatory debate, negotiation, and planning. It was this catalytic role and the emotions it stirred that led perhaps inevitably to CORE being discontinued in 1996. It was created by the provincial government as a challenge to itself and to the public to embrace uncomfortable but essential change. CORE unsettled established practices and influences and mobilized a broader range of interests in decision making. That's uncomfortable, yes, and about controversy and debate and negotiation and emotions, right? But that's democracy, I think. As I say, at least the way it's described here. Anyway, I hope that we can keep this visioning in our minds as we think about, in this conference, about practical improvements to EA, but all of us here join us as we move forward in this province and keep our childish hopes for the future, so that one day the developer looks out over the Jumbo Valley and other valleys and sees other stories of what this place is, what is to be done there, and who is qualified to decide. Thanks.
Thank you, Cam. We have, some time for a few questions. And Robin, are you here? Can you, or she might be up in the booth there. Oh, there you are. Okay, great. Do you want to come up this morning?
Meredith?
Yeah. So, is there a question?
I've lost my voice, so I can't. I don't think I can answer any. I'll turn them to you.
Don't everyone ask questions at once.
Cam, you showed a slide, and I'm wondering if you could put it up again. It talks about glacier resorts, grizzly bear monitoring program, and also there's a sentence in there about, there we go, down at the bottom.
Yeah.
Proponent will be compelled to maintain their proposed monitoring program. If anybody here in this room believes that the government would really compel glacier resorts to maintain a monitoring program, they're just living in a dream world. The government would never compel them to do anything like that. They just put it down on paper that they will, but they won't. And in one of the slides, I saw the term streamline. And I think that all citizens, when they hear a government talk about streamlining a process, they should be very, very worried, because what the government means by streamlining is to get rules and regulations out of the way so industry can do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah, environmental assessment's inevitably about some kind of trade-offs, and streamlining is usually, efficiency. It sounds like a good thing, except what does that trade off? Inclusivity trades off thoroughness.
Back?
Who decides the process of the assessment? Is there like a template that the government uses, or?
Well, assessments come under the Environmental Assessment Act. It's a pretty lean document. It leaves a lot up to discretion, but there are certain steps that an EA will go through. Increasingly, there are a number of guidance documents that, that's the process. It's so there's a number of steps. There's guidance documents that support some of the work done here. Some of it will also relate to other policies. But really importantly, there is a lot of discretion. And discretion can be, as I'm saying here, can actually, can work both ways. Be great to have a lot of discretion, because then you've got a lot of flexibility and adaptability. If the political culture within the office is one that's, taking environmental and social concerns very seriously, then we probably would want to see a very flexible discretionary process. But if it's based on, I think some of these commitments that I've shown here, you may actually want to have more firm guidelines and something that's a little bit more structured.
Do they look just at the environment, or do they take into account culture?
Well, they no longer take into account culture. That was actually in the 1995 Act and got struck out, kind of controversially. But they do look at heritage effects and social and economic and environmental. One other. Health. Yeah, impacts. So right from the start, right in 1969 with the first process in the United States, they realized quite quickly that it wasn't just going to be biophysical effects. You can't, you can't eliminate other social dimensions.
Where does the general project stand now? The government said, okay, no, but I understand that they're going to, or I've heard that they're going to decrease the number of beds available so that they don't have to go through the.
Yeah, so in June of last year, June 2015, the environmental certificate was canceled. Since then, they've made two different kind of very opposing paths for themselves. The first is that they've said, as you say, that they would like to move forward on a smaller resort, which a resort with 2,000 beds or smaller can move forward without an environmental assessment. That's doesn't necessarily. The minister has discretion to still require that project to undergo an environmental assessment. At the same time, they filed a request for judicial review in the BC Supreme Court. So they're challenging the decision that squashed the environmental certificate. So that's in the court system right now. Please.
Yeah. I think that the shortest answer to the question that as it stands right now, the developers are prohibited from development in the Jumbo Valley. Right now. So how long that lasts is of course in question, but today the condition is they can't build anything. That may change, and of course they're working very hard to change it. But the condition today is no development.
And they've launched their own judicial review.
Yeah.
Was that your question as well? Okay. And, sorry, do you have a follow-up? You're okay. Okay, Martin.
Karen, you mentioned, you talked about wanting to politicize more of the process actually. You gave me, I think you gave us a sense of where that would be, what that would be for you, in your vision, and I appreciate that. But if I was going to press you a bit to sort of, in a more, maybe in a concrete kind of way to discuss how you might go about, because when I heard you saying, I kind of started thinking about maybe hierarchies of and maybe they don't have to be hierarchical, but that's with my good lawyer framework. So, you know, we might think about human rights and effects on human rights before we think about proprietary or economic rights or something like that. And is that, like, how would you say it should be more political? How would you see that playing out?
Well, one of the things I just wanted to pick up on philosophically, well, stepping back for a moment, I just want to be kind of provocative because we always talk about depoliticizing environmental assessment. And yet I'm also very wary of what that looks like as a sci-fi fan, what it looks like to have, you know, the imagination of a perfectly rational, technical, objective, apolitical process, I think is untenable. And I think it's been, you know, at least 40 or 50 years of research again, or you know, just philosophical thinking against that. So I'm trying to just challenge us when we say depoliticizing, what do we really mean? And I want us to think about repoliticizing in terms of more like, you know, some of the specific mechanisms that I described are actually, you know, I think some of the same that you described earlier in your talk, right? I think that, you know, I'd like to see much more expansive participatory land use planning, much more democratic land use planning within which environmental assessment sits. So what I'm saying by, you know, on one hand, I guess you've got the dream of a perfect, rational, objective, technical, scientific process, right? The other side, you've got what we think of as a politicized process, one that's about unbalanced power relations, about silencing certain voices. And what I'm trying to say is actually where it's not depoliticizing we want, it's, you know, it's repoliticizing, democratizing environmental assessment. And that would take a number of different forms, but rather the politics of silencing voices, I'd like to see the politics of actually bringing more voices in.
So one way, if I could just,
Yeah.
So in my experience anyways, I mean, because, so what happens is you have to write the process, but we try to bin sort, right? We try to do it sort of, and I think I referred to this morning sort of as 2 stages. The first stage is supposed to be quasi-objective, science-based, you know, what is actually happening on the ground. And then the second stage is that decision-making stage, and that's where I sort of see a more, that's sort of, for me, that's a comfortable, intuitive place for politics, as you say. And I think that you know, where I wouldn't necessarily want to see it just being a free-for-all in every context. I still think we want that objective information gathering process, science-based process, also traditional knowledge, all that kind of stuff. But then that coming into a decision-making process, and there you get into that sort of discussion, absolutely, public participation, local participation, First Nations, and all that kind of stuff. And so,
But I'd say even in that stage, we're still not, I mean, we're still looking out over that space and seeing something different, even when you add traditional knowledge, or even when you add, in this case, you know, that this is a sacred valley. I mean, that's, that's very objective to Tanaka people, right?
yeah, no, for sure.
But I think that, if you press me far enough, yeah, I'll probably be able to go any further. But I think even at that first stage, you still have to be wary of the politics of seeing.
I think that there's also a fear inherent in many structured decision-making processes that we see it at the local government level, at the provincial government level. We see it at board tables where there's a fear of the irrational public. When you go to a public hearing in my community of Invermere, it's a very small community of 3,000 largely rational human beings. When you go into a public hearing, you are asked, please, to refrain from showing emotion when you provide comment. If you take a 3-year-old who is having a tantrum and tell them to stop doing that, that is absolutely the most useless thing in the world to do. If we continue to push the way people feel, the way they connect, the way they exist in landscapes out of the process, we will continue inevitably, I believe, to have very adversarial processes. When I walk into a room, if my emotions, my feeling, my sense of place, my rootedness in environment is actually not allowed, you bet I'm going to bring that into the room, because it is who I am. It's what brought me to the room. We ought not to be so afraid of that, because the public is, there are crazies out there, and there's always someone who's going to disrupt a process. We can manage that in a civil society. We cannot manage that by silencing people in government process.
You have questions?
I wanted to question go back to the issue in terms of at the sort of science stage or the information stage. You brought up the example just in passing around the cumulative effects management framework for the Elk Valley. Just today I happened to talk to several people who are on the teams working on that, and every one of them pointed out to me that in the workshop that's coming up, that what's come down from the top is people worked very hard to put the information together, had good, diverse teams, and they had maps in terms of risk assessment, and everything was done in terms of color coding. And blue, you go from, green was things were great, blue, there's some concern, but it's okay, orange and red. Well, what was happening was most of the things were coming up orange and red. And as a result, word came from that island out there somewhere that didn't want to see orange and red on the map. And so everything people are going to see, I'm told, will be blue. And I said, well, how did they change the parameters? And they said, nobody changed any parameters. They just changed the colors to blue. And so that's the information that the public will be is going to work with, of it's all okay. And we've got baselines consistently that are changing. Is it 10 years ago? Is it 5 years ago? Is it 2 years ago? And we're looking at baseline information. And this applies to all the environmental assessments. And that is all politicized. And I'd say the problem is, and I did see how you mentioned, and I'm sure it's there somewhere, but ultimately how it's politicized goes right to the very bottom, and that comes right through the minister's office. And so your democracy is actually demonstrated in who is elected by the minister, or who is elected by the people, and it ends up being that particular minister. But I don't think we can, I'm nervous about saying, oh, well, it'll all be political, because in fact, if we don't start talking, we can't have a good conversation without good information. And then we all can yell at each other on the emotional level. And I don't totally agree that it's great to just, everybody throws their emotions out, and I'm a fairly emotional person, so I definitely do that.
Yeah.
But the point is that you have to have a strong common ground, and there has to be a broad agreement on values. Without that, we don't have any discussion. And I kind of miss this whole thing. Everybody gets to have their values. Well, no, you've got to find the common values and make sure everybody's working on it, because otherwise we'll never come together. And I just throw that out to you and wonder how that integrates, those comments integrate into what you were saying.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you began was kind of the dark politicization that I'm not at all accepting of. And I'm not, and I think I just sort of introduced it here, but I'd like to talk much more about some of the challenges of, deliberative democracy or agonistic democracy. I'm not as afraid of dissent. I don't think that, I think there actually can be very vibrant and very conflictual processes that can be managed well. I'm a little bit wary. I agree with you looking for common ground, but I'm also wary of often in processes where we're looking for common ground is often silencing certain people that aren't very aren't feeling welcome to provide their comments in those sorts of forums. So I don't think I disagree with you, except that I'm a little bit more open to processes where there will be a little bit more debate and structure.
I'm not questioning debate. I
Yeah.
love debate.
Yeah.
But the thing is that if you are just discussing whether you're going to do jumbo or not, rather than discussing what values are we going to maintain, then it gets very, very difficult to have a real discussion. Once everybody's decided, we may be different in terms of how those are going to be maintained, but if there isn't some sort of a general consensus around values, even if they're very broad, you really are talking over here and over here, and that's not a debate anymore. That's just yelling at each other.
And I completely agree with you there. I just think that, and all I'm trying to say here is, if we think of this simple framework on this slide right here of thinking about who's qualified to say what a particular place is and what is done to it, then environmental assessment starts looking like something that should be not just relegated to the realm of thinking it's just some technical, scientific, objective, nerdy process that we don't even have to worry about. I tell my students at UVic that it's not like we need to have courses on environmental assessment because we have to bring this into the realm of political discussion and not just assume that the folks down on Yates Street are like taking care of our best interest. And that's mainly what I'm talking about politicizing EA, is that it should be a topic, a subject of debate and discussion. And there should be a lot more voices that are involved in it. And what I came away from many environmental assessments, for example, is that there needs to be a much stronger Indigenous voice. There needs to be a much more strong non-Indigenous voice that's able to talk about how much they care about the places that they live in. And I guess that's what the point that I'm trying to make.
John, I think that the example that you raised too highlights for me, we're talking about, what would an ideal environmental assessment process look like, or how could it be improved? And I think the piece that as citizens and I don't know, maybe it's a Canadian thing, but government's going to do this for us. They should make a better process. But what you as an informed citizen look at that and at the information and say, that's all blue, but that used to be red, orange, and blue, and that means something, and you bring that to the table. It's our responsibility as citizens, as much as I really would rather not be engaged in the minutia of some of these processes. That is, if we want to steward the land in the modern world, that's part of what's required, and it's sometimes horribly painful, but to come into a room and say, strongly, and maybe with some emotion, that blue is not the truth. There's another truth there that's been blue washed, and we ought to change that. We have a responsibility as the public to engage very actively and to demand more of our environmental assessment process, but also to demand more of ourselves as engaged citizens. In many ways, I think we've abdicated our responsibility in the hands of government, and it's really not working that well.
Okay, 2 questions. George?
I went to meet the MP before the election, right? And I talked to him, one of them, well, actually 2 of them, about jumbo. They made up their mind. Everybody, we've only lived in the valley for going on 10 years. And I was just beginning to learn about it. Everybody I talked to was against jumbo. So I bring it up to this guy, and I'm from Alberta originally, so I didn't know much about BC except they had NDP for years, yeah. And he didn't want to hear that all the people I know are against jumbo. He said, no, it's been decided. Same with HST, IPPs. I was amazed at how much the government doesn't want to hear. They're just
Well, I guess that's why I would call for in the way I'm using politicizing now, that's what I'm talking about.
yeah.
Is that has to be thrown out for debate and discussion and not just predetermined and pushed through.
Yeah.
even more notoriously at our federal government level with omnibus budget bills and things.
George has a question.
I'd like to make a comment, and I'd be interested in your comment. If there was one part of the environmental impact assessment process which is not politicized, it is the preparation of that EIA. It is often done, indeed, by independent consultants, and you can mention that as much, and it quoted in the case of this project some material from that regards. Preparation is based in science, evidence that which is available, compiled, and then thrust into the public forum through that public review process, where after that, indeed, and perhaps not surprisingly, to deal with the complexities of what is faced, thus begins what you refer to as a politicized process. Why would one expect anything different in the complex world in which we live? In order to make these judgment calls, we often rely, in the end, truly not, on elected officials to, as the process winds its way, eventually they encounter it, along with, we hope, with the best of intentions, the full engagement of all individuals with something to say. But I return to my first point. Preparation of the assessment in its content, in terms of what it has navigated in response to public concern, is not a politicized process. And I'd be curious to know if you may have some comment in regards to what I raised, which is fundamentally delineation, threshold, if you will, between a world which is inhabited non-politically, but subsequently, well, yes, that many, many things in many shapes and forms may happen.
Well, I would begin just by saying I wouldn't argue against, I hope I haven't made it seem like I'm against good sound science being an important part of this process. But I probably wouldn't agree completely that even the collection of data is always unpoliticized.
And why would you say that?
Well, I think that there's, I think that consultants are guided by a code of ethics, but there's certainly instances where the data that have been collected have not been adequate, have been politicized, have been, and I don't want to go down the path of pointing fingers at consultants for the work they've done. But I would even step further back and say even some of the things that we look at when we're the kind of work we do, we break down an environmental assessment into the study of valued ecosystem components, and there's a judgment call made in terms of what kind of components we're going to look at, and then consultants will go out and do the work. That's fine, but even at that stage, we've already added some kind of discretion. And I'm not saying discretion is bad either, and I'm not saying professional judgment is bad. I don't see how else we could do environmental assessment. But what I'm just opening us to think about is that all of those decisions sit within a context where there's a number of different questions that will inform that judgment, or will inform or produce that context. And I'm not trying to be conspiracy theorist here or anything. I'm trying to point out anyway, this is moving really slow. I don't completely agree with you that a consultant goes out and objectively gathers data and that there's no social context within which that's happened.
No, not completely. I think you should completely disagree, because I could tell you for a fact that you hire, and I could name names, certain consultants, you'll get the answers that you want, and if somebody else doesn't have enough money to hire a consultant to look into the issue, you will not have good science at the foundation. And I've seen it, I've been around long enough and been in enough processes time and time again. There is bad science in those, and to suggest that if you get one from one consultant, you've got hard science, that's a fantasy. I'm sorry, but I have to say strongly that's the case.
The other concern I have with the notion that there's this objective, rational process of data collection that then is launched out into this madly human political process is that that there's a consistent application of scope, that there's been a discussion about, what period of time ought the field research to be done over, what geography ought it to be done over, and very often, in my experience, limited albeit, that those determinations about scope are being made by a project proponent, not by through some scientifically rigorous process that says that if we're going to assess cumulative impact, or we're going to assess impacts, let alone cumulative impacts, which we generally don't do, if we're going to assess impact, well, I as the proponent think that the impact that's assessed should be here. But I as a citizen think that the impact that should be assessed is here, whether that's more or less expansive is values-based. And I think that we get into trouble when any time that we say science is separated from human value. It's not. Every scientist is bringing something to the table, and when people start to get paid for their work, I'm a consultant. When I get paid for my work, I am solidly in the room. And this is not to say that, hey, any bias is good bias. Absolutely not. The work is intended to be objective. It is not objective at any point in my own experience.
If I can maybe add to that too, just from experience, sometimes you'll hire a consultant to do the work, and they'll give a proponent an answer they don't want to hear. So they'll hire another consultant to do the work until they get the answer they want to hear.
One last question, and then
Actually, I had two questions.
your two questions.
So I'm just learning about this project, and one thing that's not really clear to me is what precisely is the underlying cause of this problem? Is it the architect? Because one thing I know is that I don't see a whole bunch of developers, I don't see vulnerability in a specific site. I see this one architect doggedly trying to develop the site. If he disappears, are other people going to replace him? Is the site vulnerable?
I think it's a very, very good question. I think what your question touches on is the privileging of a single person's dream over so many other stories that our decision-making process at
That's
this...
not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is, very concretely, if this and I'm not placing a value judgment here. This is just a basic question.
Is there another developer waiting in the wings?
If this developer disappears, because it speaks to understanding what the specific problem is. If you're going to evolve a solution, whether you use public engagement or whether you use science or planning or architecture, if you're going to solve the problem, you have to actually know what the underlying cause is. And I'm not really certain, when you talk about politicizing the discussion, I think that presumes, to an extent, I might be wrong about this, but I'm suggesting that it might presume that it doesn't question that possibly there's something fundamentally wrong with the science and that the science needs to be corrected in order to work effectively, and that because the science is flawed, these consultants who are doing this work are vulnerable to politicization. I mean, in one sense, you're saying that politicization from the consultants is problematic, but then you're saying we need to politicize this. And the next question that I want to ask...
Can I speak to that? Because that's what I'm trying not to confuse, is that I'm very sympathetic to calls to depoliticize environmental assessment. Okay, from what we've seen in in this film and in what I was sharing. There's been all kinds of unsavory activities in this review. When I'm calling to politicize, I'm calling that this process becomes something that's opened up, that's looked at, more voices are invited to be a part of this discussion in this province, and that we go beyond. Environmental assessment as a project-by-project enterprise, I think, is a big problem in this province anyway, because really, and what I was trying to get at here was that these are places that we live in, and we come to care about these places we live in, and what is the forum for expressing that?
I think when you talk about places that we live in, that's entirely valid. But in my experience, when you talk about places that we live in, you communicate to the converted crowd. When you don't, and the one way to really reach diverse opinions and attitudes and sort of try and disperse some of the polemics, which I think politicizing does, is to find a language that speaks to the whole range of interests. And I still want you to answer the first question, but
I will answer the question.
I'll ask my second question, and then I'll let somebody else talk. How much of this do you think has to do, you talked about architects. I think we can see that there's something fundamentally problematic with the architect when he starts comparing mountains with cathedrals. I mean, the concept, they're conceptually diametrically opposed. It's bunk. It doesn't make sense, and that's what should be challenged. But then you also have environmental science, you have the professions of planning, you've got all these different professions involved. How much do you attribute to deficiencies in educating these professionals? And how much is it that these people are really morally or ethically misdirected? And how much is it that maybe they just don't have the specific competencies that they require to manage the complexity of this problem or this project?
Well, I can't speak for that, but they do. Yeah, maybe they are incompetent.
It seems that this is you're asking historically a question that's grounded in the time that we're in history. Our society sees the world in, generally in certain ways, and we value science over emotion. And that's informing how, when I went to school and studied planning, that our societal worldview informs things. I think informs the decisions that I make. I think we're at a time in history where those value structures are starting to be challenged by great natural forces like climate change that are making us reconsider. I don't think I would say that there's a deficiency in the education system or in the knowledge base of all these myriad, very committed and intelligent people who are participating in probably a flawed process. But
it's not about commitment and intelligence. It's about competency. People in the field
I'm not sure I agree.
Educational psychology and advanced education are themselves challenged by the question of how do we educate students to solve complex problems. And they recognize that there is a deficiency in education. They recognize this. But I observe that in environmental science, certainly in planning, I think planning is extremely problematic. In architecture, even in environmental science, are we training people do they actually, maybe they just don't have the specific skills. Maybe we need to change the way we educate them. Because if we hand the problem over to even the public, and I agree with you, I think that the Tunaka people should be able to determine what is done here. But if you hand it over to public opinion, are these people going to be able to forward a valid argument, a convincing argument that will put everybody on the same side?
We explored this whole concept in the Human Dimensions conference that we had in Kimberley a couple of years ago, because it was dealing with how do we solve wicked problems. They're exactly the ones that you're talking about. And I think Jim was one of them.
It's definitely a wicked problem.
How are people doing? We had two people here who wanted to ask a question. I sense a lot of people are also disappearing, but if people
I'm
are
about to fall
willing, we
asleep.
have 2 questions right here. You first, yeah. And your neighbor. Yeah.
Jerry.
Yeah, Cam, just a very quick and direct question. In your matrix of how the environmental assessment approval process works,
Okay.
you come to a point where, as you mentioned today, that the Minister of the Environment is one of the key cabinet ministers, and there's always a second minister make the judgment whether a certificate will be granted or not.
Mhm.
Now, do you have any sort of knowledge of how to improve? You're talking, that's where in a way, where the political process really is at the fore. Do you have any ideas of how that might be made a better process?
So that's the people speaking when the
Yeah.
when the minister is able to make that decision instead of the bureaucrat making. It's not the executive director of
I mean,
the
you could say,
EO
okay,
making.
it'll be made by the cabinet. Well,
I don't have a recommendation there, Jerry. I think that what I'd like to see way before that, I'd like to see this process drastically improved so that by the time it got to a decision and went to the ministry and the recommendation that was put forward would actually have the support of a wide number of people.
I just wanted to say, how much I enjoyed this discussion, but we seem to have drifted off onto so many philosophical levels that we're forgetting all about the issue. Now, if you want to build a new school in a town, you have a referendum. You let people vote on it. The taxpayers get to say something. Here we're not even talking about what the thing depends on. Will it be profitable? What's happening with climate change? What's happening with the glaciers? What's happening with the grizzly bear? Those questions are being overlooked, and they're drifting off, and the stick has been hanging on for 25 bloody years. And what are we doing? We're talking philosophical discussions. The fact is, the people of this area have said they don't want the damn thing. And so I'm asking, why are we going back to the roots of the discussion? We've got other things to talk about now. We said no, accepting, first of all, nobody's listening to us. And secondly, we're not getting the proper platform in which to say no. Like, have we had any kind of a vote? No. Somebody on an island out in the Pacific, I think they call it Vancouver Island, is going to make the decisions that will affect our lives. And what are we doing about it? We're talking about philosophical silence. Hey, let's get out and stop this thing and get back to life again.
That seems like a good note to end on. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, presenters today, and we are back here at 8:30. We're starting our sessions, and the desk will be open at 8 o'clock, and we'll be revisiting some of these philosophical questions. We're going to do some practical stuff in the morning. First of all, looking at what is social assessment from a cultural perspective. And then in the afternoon, starting in the morning, we're going to be doing the panel, which is all focused on how do we improve the process of environmental assessment. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.